Astrology is much like studying symptoms of a patient when it comes to holistic aspects, in that we basically look at the astrological chart as in terms of generalities, proclivities, and then analyzing further more into the specifics. Just like in homeopathy, where you study the constitution, first and foremost, you determine the archetypal pattern of the person, the general nature of the individual. Then, of course, you study further into their disease or their problem patterns as far as their modalities and their symptoms. So we do the same thing in astrology. Let's review quickly some things that should be kept in mind before we get into very specific parts of the lectures. One is we have a circular band around which our sun and earth travels, and from ancient times it was called the zodiac, of which it was divided into 12 sectors or positions. And from these we have general archetypal patterns that are noted for rhythmic patterns, particulars and places of planet placements. We know that at certain times and periods when the sun or the moon or other planets are there are certain tendencies to movements or energies. Again, we speak of, like constitutions, we speak of things in astrology called elements. Elements are like archetypal patterns, which we're going to be speaking of here in just a few minutes. And then in addition to elements, we have another thing that was called in Hindu called tendencies to movement. In other words, a modality, or how something moves in time. And in reference to the zodiac, we have what's called the cardinal signs, which you could denote as being positive signs or initiation signs. We have negative signs, which are called fixed, which means that their tendency to movement is more centripetal, more contractive, more stationary, in fact more stubborn. And then a third tendency to movement regarding elements is muticity, or mutable. In other words, they vacillate from positive to negative. So we have 4 elements, of which express 3 tendencies to movement, or 3 types of movements, and that 3 times 4 equals 12, and thus we have 12 movements of the zodiac, or 12 planetary archetypal patterns. You have a fixed band denoted by what is called the fixed stars, or the constellations, which mark the zodiac, which endow us with certain types of rays, certain types of qualities of energy. These are modified by surrounding planets, which we denote in the horoscope or the chart, and the movements and the angular relationships of these planets denote certain types of tendencies of movement, or certain proclivities, as the planets rotate in time. And then finally you have what we call the great luminaries. In our case, that is the sun, the moon, and also the ascendant, which is the modifier between the two. So when it comes in terms of studying the chart, the most important thing we start with, the core energy of the individual, the core types of reactions, responses, or behaviors the individual would have. We first study the sun, the moon, the ascendant. We look further to then the planets, or what other tendencies, characteristics, behavioral patterns, or movements are responsive in the individual, and that can range from psychology to physiology to pathology. And then the archetypal patterns of the zodiac, where these planets are placed at a certain point in time or at a certain point in progress in time. So that gives you sort of a background of how we look at the chart, what we do to construct that. And then, of course, our job, myself and Dr. Merritt's job, is to give you the basis to be able to get to the point to look at something that on appearance looks very complicated, when in reality, once you understand the symbols, the signs, and so forth, you will get to a point where you'll be able to access and read lots of data from a chart so constructed like this, which we run out on our Time Cycles computer program. So just as a radiologist would look at an X-ray and see all kinds of things into an X-ray, and you would look at an X-ray and see absolutely nothing but black and white, we have to, as astrologers, then in turn learn the signs and symbols and keynotes of how this chart is constructed, what it looks like. And the first thing, of course, is to learn what all these little doodads mean, because without knowing what the little doodads are, you're completely lost in time, because it is another alphabet that you have to learn. So let's look at that alphabet very quickly. In your notes, we have provided you a very ancient, this was by James Lippincott, I think it was 19 1927. Yes, it was. 1927. I got from a very rare book out of my library, but it's a nice little chart because it says a lot for you as a study guide. First off, you notice the grand circle around the outside pattern is towards the back of your study guides in the appendix. Okay? Towards the back of the circle, it gives you the 12 constellations known as the zodiac. Zodiac comes from the word zodiacus, I believe, which means animal, if I remember my Greek mythology correctly. And animals were, of course, used at that time because people were very much in contact with nature. I suppose someday in the Aquarian age we'll have a new zodiac which will not use animals. We'll probably use some type of hyperspace computer glyphs or some corporate logos which will surround the chart. But in those days it was an animal because an animal told a story. And our whole keynote is to learn the story of the zodiac. Okay? Because once you learn the story, then you're able to make interpretations based upon background information. And I'll repeat it and repeat it and repeat it throughout this seminar. The chart alone does not tell us anything. You always read the person, then you read the chart, you merge the two together and come up with an interpretation. Okay? It just shows generalities. It doesn't reach to specific conclusions based on a number of different parameters which we will get into later. So starting at the very left hand of the wheel, you have Aries, the keynote, self-assertiveness. Taurus, determination, which is a fixed sign. Gemini, versatility. Cancer, capacity for home life. Leo, affection, selfish love. Discrimination, partnership in Libra. Secret forces of nature in Scorpio. Aspiration of Sagittarius. Position and honors of Capricorn. Altruism and selfless love of Aquarius, and finally the superphysical of Pisces, each one of those telling a story. Now in the chart itself, we have another division, which is in reference to the Earth and the place it was located at the time of birth, and this is called the house systems. And the Earth, too, is divided into 12 pieces of pie, or 12 sectors, or along its meridians. You have the grand zodiac circling, in which case you would also then have an Earth with 12 sectors running from North Pole to South Pole, divided up in sort of a pie. And that determines your location here on Earth at the time that you were born. So you have a star-based chart, and you also have a Earth-based chart, all read within one chart, as in this case, because here you'll see that in the center core, representing the planet Earth, you have 1. And then on the outside wheel, you have the zodiac interpretation telling you where the zodiac signs were posited at that particular time of the chart basis. So you have an outside wheel within an inside wheel in a two-dimensional configuration. So back to the clock of destiny chart, you have here the house systems inside. First house representing early environment, childhood, the home. Second house representing possessions, notably money when it comes to mundane matters. Third house, the lower mind, or communication, short journeys, brothers and sisters. Fourth house, the conditions of old age as well as the conditions of the home life when you were just developing as a child and getting bondage with your mother. Fifth house, the house of children, also the house of beginning adolescence. Also the house of speculation and gambling. If you have a bad house configuration in the 5th house, it's recommended you don't gamble throughout your life because you have a 5th house affliction. 6th house, called the house of health, which is just more or less of an ancient consideration because at that time the 6th house also rules Virgo, which is digestion, and most of the diseases suffered by mankind at those times, since they did not have Food Lion and shopping malls and supermarkets, the food was a big consideration in determining the health, so therefore they deposited it and they called it the house of health, but as you'll be learning with us, each house has a particular function when it comes to health. Although the 6th house is a major determinant in the chart, because people still eat wrong to this day. Libra, the 7th house, both you see here are associated. The 7th house is associated with the story of Libra. But the house denotes mundane matters, whereas the zodiac represents more spiritual or archetypal patterns. So there is a differentiation. House interpretations are more mundane. They deal with the environment, the outside world. We could say the zodiac represents consciousness, represents reincarnation, represents growth, pattern of the soul. The inside houses represent the mundane matters of life and the geophysical factors, the environment that affects us from a day-to-day basis. Eighth house represents Scorpio. Here you find or look for the cause of death. It also shows latent occult ability, also inheritance that comes to you from outside. Ninth house is dealing with the higher mind, with the person's philosophical base, how they perceive the world, as well as also on a mundane level, long journeys and trips. It is stated if you have ninth house afflictions, for example, Mars in the ninth, you're cautioned to be on the lookout for traveling long distances because Mars means accidents. 10th house is the house of ambition, also the house of profession, occupation. It's where your statute is in life when you get to the penultimate of your career. This is like the house of the time between 40 and 55 or 65 years old before retirement. It's where you reach yourself in your highest peak of your career, and those are associated also with the picture or the story of Capricorn. Aquarius is 11th house, that's friends, companions, but on a higher level it also means associations, clubs, functions, societies that you belong to, professional friendships, colleagues, and those kinds of factors as well. And lastly, the 12th house, probably the most mysterious house of the zodiac, associated with the sign Pisces, which is ruled by Neptune. This is the house of destiny, the house also of debts, and as it's said by many, is the house of your last life. The sign that the 12th house is posited in was the sign that you left in your last life previous to this incarnation. Now this wheel is also very helpful because in the center you can see that there's some interpretations made for you regarding the houses and the signs. For example, here at number 1 you have fire, you have a house that's cardinal, also rules the head, and then you can see you have some things here that says the rulership, exaltation, detriment, and fall. Okay? Detriment and fall. What this means is that when planets are positioned in these signs in the zodiac, they can either be in their rulership house, they can be in the house of detriment or their worst place house, they can be also in the house or the sign of exaltation, which is their greatest place that they could be. For example, Saturn is in exaltation in Libra. And then it can also be in their fall, which means that there is a mixed energy there that results in different types of negativities or influences or modalities. So the chart is very useful for you to look at and study, use as a reference guide. You can see also within every 30-degree sector, there's these little positions here where it says 10, 20, and 30. Those are called decanates. Okay, those are called decanates, and that's a further subdivision of the zodiac based upon the house locations. For example, Aries is a fire sign, so the first 10 degrees is ruled by its ruling planet, which would be Mars. But the second decanate of Aries would be the second fire sign, which would be Leo, which would have very much influences of the sun. And of course, lastly, the third decanate of Aries would be ruled by Sagittarius, which is the other fire house. And there you have like an overlay pattern. You have a synergy. Now, decadents are something we study when it comes to physiognomic types. In other words, decadents rule very much the physical form and how the body looks, the certain features of the person. So the decadent of your rising sign determines a lot of how your face is shaped, what your eyelids are like, the kind of hair that you have, the stature, or how tall or how short you are, and those types of things. Now, let's look at another factor here. Again, I'm just speaking now in terms of generalities. The zodiac basically is a map of evolution of the individual. It is a map of evolution. It's very much tied in with the concept of reincarnation and karma. You can't really separate astrology from the belief or the observation that man reincarnates on a wheel called the wheel of life, or the zodiac, known in Hindustan. And we have so many interpretations based upon this, it almost gets to the point of being a religion, but there are general trends we read in the chart. Now, for example, when it comes to houses, I told you that the luminaries are the great things that we observe within the zodiac. And we could even start all of our basis of interpretation, for example, is in the 4th and 5th house, because in the 4th and 5th house, so much is determined in life. A lot of things happen in the 4th and 5th house because you're now going from childhood to adolescence, and you're either going to break the bonds and become a new person in this life, or you're going to follow the path of least resistance, which is your moon. The moon represents the karma, the habits, the proclivities, the nature that you were in the last life. It's your reactionary patterns. It's the easiest thing for you to do. So you're either a little mama's baby who never grew up, who still lives at home, or you're now following your sun and your destiny. And from there, energy flows. So there's an archetypal pattern just from looking at the sun and at the moon in regards to interpreting the chart. If you become sun-bound person, your task in life is to move on, to go into the 6th house and start accepting responsibilities, which is Virgo. And then from there, you go into the 7th house, further accepting responsibilities of marriage. And then after you're happily married, you accept the next responsibility, which is sex. And you learn how to deal with that factor within your life and how to deal with it effectively and as an adult. And then from there, you move into higher philosophies of life and you start to learn about new religions and new aspirations that you have within your soul that's meant to be an evolutionary pattern. And from there into your 10th house, which is your occupation. And your ultimate responsibility is your career factor that will guide the rest of your karma into the next evolutionary phase of life. Many people, however, follow their moon. Their emotions get away from them. They take the path of least resistance, and they go downscale. They go back into the 3rd house, which is Gemini. And it's associations with brothers and sisters, short trips, common jobs, common occupations. They generally are not forerunners of the scheme of life. Or further, they run into 2nd house matters, which is of possessions. And as I'll show you later, there's what we call the Buddhic conditions of life, where I'll show you from another aspect how this is viewed upon. And then they fall back into 1st house things, which is reliving early childhood experiences where they start to become entrapped with very serious nervous shocks that occurred in their life, which are now embedded in their subconscious and very deeply planted, which is one reason why you're here taking this course, because we're going to be teaching you photocognitive therapy, where you regress people back to very early childhood and find these very awful things that happened to them, these childhood abuse patterns, these very bad environments that affected their behavior that is living with them to this day. And then falling back further, you get into the 12th and 11th houses, where in the case of Pisces, it's a very mysterious house. It's where karma, just like a watershed of karma, falls onto you. And then lastly, in Aquarius, you just basically go into beyond a Neptunian spin into a Uranian spin, and you just lose it all. So this is one view of looking how there are archetypal patterns of consciousness. Again, we're speaking in terms of generalities. You begin your study of astrology with generalities, and then later we move into the specifics. Now let's talk a little bit about astrological Hippocratic temperaments. Hippocratic temperaments. This is basically the concept of whether you're earth, air, fire, or water. And this is on page 29 of your study guide lecture notes, a synopsis of that. And in terms of generalities, we look to see if people are primarily air-bound, primarily fire-bound, primarily earth-bound, or primarily water-bound. Well, you would say, well, then how do you do that? Well, it's very simple. We would go back to this chart. This is the zodiac chart with the houses. Okay? And in terms of the zodiac, we look to see where the planets are positioned. Where are they, just standing back the forest to the trees, we look to say, where are all the planets positioned? Do we have an imbalanced chart here? Do we have a well-rounded chart? Do we have a bucket chart? Do we have stelliums where a lot of planets are piled up into one particular sector of the chart? Okay, that means an out-of-balance condition. Looking at this chart, for example, the houses are kind of spread out all around the chart. That indicates a well-balanced situation. There is elements of air, there's elements of fire, there's elements of earth, and there's elements of water in the chart, for example. Okay? When there is an imbalance, there's a lack of water, lack of air, lack of fire, then there's imbalance in the constitution of the person. This was very much a study of Chinese medicine, for example, when to this day, in Hong Kong, for example, many of the Chinese babies, the parents and the grandparents will get into an argument or a fight just naming the child. They'll go to geomancers and they'll go to astrologers to determine their chart type to see if there's any elemental imbalance in them. And then if there is, they're given a name with the name of the element within the name. So, for example, if you were lacking wood, the character for wood in Chinese, which is similar to trees, would appear in your name. Like my name, McWilliams, has wood within it because I'm called a spring chicken in the Chinese chart. Okay? So you would be given the name wood because you're lacking wood, so that each time someone speaks your name, they intone the sound wood, which brings benefit and good fortune to the person. See? So you can see how just the very ancient historical concepts are so wrapped within all cultures of the world except the American culture, which is lost in space, funneling down the hyperspace tube of the information highway, never forever to return to their historical roots. So we look at the chart overall to note these certain balances. Now, we do have one element which unfortunately has been very mistranslated in the fashion industry, because it's well known within the fashion industry that, or it's at least tried or are positioned to learn about whether your skin type or your physiognomy is spring, summer, fall, or winter. Have you all heard of that? Familiar? Well, the origin of that was astrology. Had nothing to do with what they're saying in the books. It was a fervent study of the father of medicine, Hippocrates. In fact, in the ancient books, and even the older homeopathic books, they are called the Hippocratic Temperaments. It's considered the grandest typology of medicine to this day, because the Hippocratic temperament, okay, says many things about the person. And you have on your list there on page 23 a synopsis of those certain proclivities. For example, a spring type, as far as skin tones go, would be delicate skin that's finely textured and a bit oily, you see. And through that, and understanding that, the hair also is generally of golden shades, or strawberry blonde, or even redhead, golden brown, dove gray, or creamy white as they get older. And therefore, based on that, the best colors for them to wear, which complement and highlight their features, would be blues, ivories, lemons, scarlets, turquoise, and aquas, you see. So by knowing your Hippocratic temperament, you can pick out the best colors that enliven you best. These are the colors that should ornate your home. It should be in your wardrobe. It will bring out the better features of you. And nothing's more evident than to go to a department store and get fine clothing and absolutely pick out the wrong color for yourself. It just makes you look awful, doesn't it? Hideous. Well, you can determine that very easily by understanding whether you are predominantly a spring, summer, fall, or winter type. And it's rather simple to do on the outset with astrology. You simply take this chart I've constructed for you here, and you give yourself some points by wherever the planets are placed. And you work out a little index chart, and you tally up the totals in the right-hand corner and add them all up. And the one that's predominant, okay, the one that's predominant is generally what your typical type is. And then you would simply come to this reference chart and kind of read this and go, yep, that's me, you've got it, okay? You've got your elemental type. Then we look at the crosses. We look at the grand crosses of the chart, what's called the cardinal cross, the fixed cross, and the mutable crosses. And we look to see the planetary spreads from that aspect. So we've now gone from elements to spreads within the chart. And I'll give you a few keynotes here. The cardinal cross people are people that have planets spread out in these signs, okay? That's your fixed crosses there. And if you see a predominance of planets spread that way, you've got people that are very quick respond to treatment, okay? They will take your advice, they will do it, and they will complete the resolution. on cardinal cross. Regarding fixed crosses, fixed is a more stationary energy, so therefore you have more chronic cases here. They're stubborn and they're not as responsive to treatment. Okay? And then lastly, you have the mutable cross. And mutable people are generally like your Geminis, your Virgos, your Sagittariuses. They're very enthusiastic at first, but they quickly putter out. They quickly lose their attention and are off to doing something else. So there's another thing that we look at, and just overall, standing back from the chart, looking just at conditions before we look at specifics. And then there's something else that we notice from the chart, and that is we look at the planets, and we also decide the evolutionary pattern of the individual. Okay, the evolutionary pattern of the individual. It's stated in astrology, and of course its ramification is throughout the chart, that the moon, for example, which is symbolized by the crescent, rules the first 7 years of life. And at that time is when the formative patterns of the person predominated. So if we were looking at disease patterns, for example, if we wanted to look at childhood diseases, we would look at the moon in regards to its natal placement and according to its transits and also its progressions. Okay? So if a person had a sun-afflicting moon, for example, generally that's a pattern where there is a lot of childhood illness, a lot of fevers and inflammations, a lot of compromised vitality because the moon and sun were at conflict. Okay? And those types of bad aspect patterns, I'll give you the codes now for them, is you have what's called the opposition, which is symbolized usually by 2 circles and a little line. Okay? You also have the square, which is just represented by a square. You have conjuncts, which is represented by a circle with a little line on it. Okay? Similarly, you have another aspect we'll be getting into called parallels, which is 2 lines just slashed together. All right? And then you have another sign called the quincunx, or a degree where the patterns are 150 degrees apart. In other words, you would have a planet located as such and a planet located as such, 150 degrees apart from itself. Okay? These are called the hard aspects. You also have easy aspects. If you, for example, had Sun trine Moon, in which case trine comes with a little triangle, means 120 degrees, in which case it would look like this. The angular relationship would be 120 on a 360-degree pi. Okay? Sextiles, which they just do like this. They make some squigglies, so they give a little quick star there. And semi-sextiles, for example. These are considered easy aspects or flowing aspects. Okay? This is where the planetary rays flow smoothly and easily. They're not conflict areas in the chart. In fact, these are just natural habits, tendencies, and proclivities of the individual. Mercury rules the period of life from 7 to 15 years. That's the formative aspect of the nervous system. That's when the intellect develops. The ability to read comes into play. Venus rules the period of life from about 15 to 24 years old, according to astrology, and that's, of course, where the sexual hormones start to develop. Puberty is initiated, and it's the time for the first love, first creative act to be exonerated. And then, of course, after that, from about 25 to 35 years is when the sun sign comes in, and that's when the soul is supposed to incarnate fix itself into the person, into the entity or vehicle, and that's when the developmental stages truly start to begin of the destiny in life. They say 35 to about 46 years is ruled by Mars. That's when you strive to move your development forward. Life becomes a bit of a struggle in your advancement. Then at about 45 to 57 years, Jupiter becomes the ruler. You start to reap the benefit of all your hard work and efforts. You start to have a more developed social life. And then from about 57 to 70 years, the great malefic Saturn sets in. The hard knocks of life are now reaching. You've reached retirement. Diseases are starting to set in. You're having to deal with physical disabilities. You're having to deal with a lot of responsibilities because of the actions that have taken place before this. And then from about 70 to 84 years of age, This is providing you make it. Providing you make it, Uranus starts to come and play. This is when you can start to get a little airy in life. You get a little eccentric. You just do things your own way, and that's all there is. And then after 84 to about 100 years of age, Neptune comes in, and you start to get a little queer and odd to other people. All your peculiar quirks start to envelop themselves. So these are the planetary rulers during the period of life. And again, it's another generality to look at in the chart. These are all the little glyphs that I wrote down for you, and you have to get used to these. Okay, you have to get used to these because this is very much a part of your notation in astrology. So there you have it. The archetypes, the zodiac signs, the planetary modifiers, and the great luminaries, the sun, the moon, and the ascendant as a modifier. Those are the grand features of the chart that we look at. We have prepared for you a lot of very interesting data, information, and how to apply this aspect we call astrology or astrobiotics to bioenergetic medicine. That is our focus. So basically, what is a horoscope? A horoscope is a star map of the location of the planets at the time an entity was born. And from that, we denote certain rhythmic patterns, certain tendencies, proclivities, certain behavioral responses that man as well as animals fall into. For astrology is a broad-based, applicable study, and essentially there are the two most ancient systems of medicine have been always astrology and herbalism. They only now have become inseparable, but in the early days they were never inseparable. It seems kind of amazing that thousands and thousands of years ago they were already charting the locations of planets. When you study this, it's just an awesome realization that here were these extremely perceptive people that were able to look at the stars, note their locations, day after day, night after night, observing the stars to the point that they envisioned certain rhythmic patterns based upon mathematical concepts of how things in nature repeat themselves. And that's really what astrology is about, is how things in nature repeat themselves. And we take that broad-based understanding from the fact that the time you were born determines a certain amount of behavioral proclivities, certain patterns within the tissue systems regarding disease, and of course taking it one step further from a more Hindu concept, actually what were the proclivities of you in a past life and what behavior patterns and responses were ingrained within the soul that are repeating them now into another life cycle. And that's what we're talking about here, and this is going to be one of the more unusual seminars where we just don't talk about it, you're actually going to be able to see it for yourself. And that's really the bottom line, isn't it? I can talk to you about past life regression all day long. I can throw you a ton of books, but until you've experienced it yourself, there are no words to actually make that happen for you. Isn't that an incredible thought? Does it seem incredible to you within 20 or 30 minutes that your mind, your soul can be accessed to the point that thoughts will come forward to you that will bring you remembrances of times that are not supposed to happen according to our Darwinian molecular concept model that we have today, but that you can see that within 30 minutes? That's a pretty fantastic thing to realize. And it's all there. It's all easily accessible if you can see the light. So, those of you who have been following me down through the years, you notice my seminars seem to get wider and wider and wider. So we're getting to the big picture of what the whole bioenergetic health response concept is. And that's what astrology provides us, is that big picture of the all-encompassing concepts to show how energy patterns repeat themselves and ingrain themselves down to the level of tissue to where there is actual physiologic responses and this beingness that we call life on the planet Earth. So essentially, bioenergetic medicine as we know it today is the study and recognition of the distribution of information from emissions of the astral and etheric bodies known to common man as sensations and feelings, likes and dislikes, loathings and longings, agreements and disagreements, etc. That is what translates into disease. That's actually the basis of homeopathy. What is homeopathy? The first things we look for in the person is the sensations, the likes, the dislikes, the feelings, the loathing and longings. These are some of our most important rubrics in homeopathy, which is why astrological medicine is very much a part of bioenergetic medicine. Much of the information I'm providing from you is very well recorded. There are some textbooks that are out there that have this, and if you're lucky where you get the old books, you can find that back in the early 1900s there were some extremely perceptive physicians, most of them being homeopaths, naturopaths, and eclectic physicians that were very much aware of all of these things. I provided extensive notes for you for this seminar so that you don't have to be busy writing, because we're going to get involved in some very technical concepts this morning and tomorrow and the third day of this seminar. So if you want to turn to your next page, I'm going to start outlining for you more or less the foundation work of what we're doing. We're working with subtle bodies here. And we have to be a bit grounded in our concepts and understanding of the subtle bodies so that we can see how they operate on the biochemistry and the tissue systems of an individual. Our overall concept is basically that man or woman, the being or the entity, has a soul. We have to recognize that factor. If it's not there, then none of this study is of any value. We are basically a multiplex plurifocal flow of transmission of data and information encased in a toroidal network. A toroidal network is something that spins on its own axis. And this is what we access. We access points of light that are surrounding the entity. We do this with light, and we do this with a certain form of meditative technique. This allows an access through the brain, through the central nervous system, to contact these points of light, which actually represent databases within the individual. These databases being all the memories of the entire life. They have an electric charge, and that's very demonstrable because all sensations denote very strong electrical charges within the entity. Most of these end up as very dyslexic neuromuscular responses. We basically see them day to day as certain habits of picking the nose, wiping the eyes, how people hold their hands. Every time these points of lights are accessed, there's like these neural responses that happen in the individual. When they perpetuate themselves, they actually have a seizure or command value on the tissue systems, first being neural, then later translating into vascular, and then ultimately choking off the organs and glands to the point that actual endocrine secretions become diminutive or superfluous. Then you have the basis of chronic disease. So that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with these points of light that are having too much of a command value over the person, and that command value then chokes off certain vascular nets, certain glandular tissues by what the Germans so eloquently said, faulty autonomic steering. Also, it's a broad base, a term we call dystonia. Dystonia. So these are all your various disses that we have in medicine. We'll be getting into those. Paracelsus, who we could say probably was the father of homeopathy, had a very nice statement. He said, "Man is related to the stars by virtue of his astral body." The astral body, astral of course means star, and that's where we get the term astrology, the star map, and how the stars relate to the astral body, which then in turn provides a foundation to understand rhythmic patterns of sensations and functions. In other words, the emotions, the emotive effect of the individual. Memory is electronic in nature, capable of impacting upon the nervous system. When recalled, these memories exist in layers or shells coming from the toroidal space and either transmit a flow of energy smoothly as harmonics, or filter the information flow as emotional armoring, hypnotic responses, phobias, and even miasms. So, why do we study the stars? To understand ourselves. Do we live by the stars? No, the big surprise is we want to get away from the stars and become an autonomous entity. See, studying astrology is really not a concept of studying something so you can use the stars to guide your life. That's the last thing that you want. You understand the stars so they stop guiding you. And then you become your own soul, your own self. And that's really what we're talking about. And we do this through a form of what we call photocognitive therapy. Photo meaning we use photons of light, cognition for recognition, and therapy because once it's realized these emotions that are surrounding us and about us and within us no longer have a command value on us. They don't alter our perceptions. And the feelings and sensations become just recognition points of reactions, but not control points where you totally lose control of yourself, lose control of your glands, your digestion, and all of these various things we're going to be talking about. So the big surprise about studying astrology is how not to let the stars guide you. And we'll be getting into that when we get into judging the esoteric chart tomorrow. So in this context, let's review this. You see we have various shells here. And we have various toroidal space points of contraction we call chakras, which the Hindus call wheels. We're going to be talking a lot about chakras because these chakras are really the access points that we use in photocognitive therapy to bring about the responses that we want to help an individual recognize who they are. That's really what it's all about, to find out who we are, to really thoroughly understand. Therapy is thus to correct the patterns necessary to restore wholeness of harmonics, leading to integration of body, mind, soul. So, from this context, we have soul, which remembers everything. That overshadows the next form down called the mental body, which in humanity at this time is relatively undeveloped. The mental body thus overshadows the astral body, and at this point in time it actually mixes with it, where we have emotion mixed with mind, and that's a concept very well known to Hindu, and that's responsible for today's large amount of what we call stress-related diseases, where the mind is not stabilized and the emotions are mixed with it, and we get these autonomic responses that are quite unusual. And actually we get a very unusual bracket of diseases that we'll be talking about when these factors mix together. The astral body then envelops and has a function over the etheric body, which is well known to acupuncture. When you study acupuncture, you are studying the etheric body. When you take galvanic skin response, you are studying the etheric body. Anything electrical of nature within the form or the corporeal physiology is guided very much by etheric currents. And that, of course, is mixed very strongly with the corporeal body or form. So the etheric body and the corporeal body are actually very bonded at this time. They're very bonded. And when this separation is severed, you have death of the entity. The etheric, of course, comes from the word ether, which, as you know, is very well known to Hindu. Now, these are overshadowing multiplex plurifocal energies. We could say at this time it's the only thing that keeps an entity alive is like a little tiny candle flame called the soul. Most people do not access that very, very quickly or very adequately. At this time, people are very mentalized. As you know, you can think about, I want you to just think about this, you can think about yourself being sick, can't you? But you're not sick right now. But if you think about yourself being sick for a long enough time, over a time factor, that in fact will start to affect your tissue systems, correct? Okay. Now, jumping one step down, you can feel yourself being sick, and that happens a lot more faster, doesn't it? That can happen over seconds, even minutes. This is well known in hypnosis. When they take a person down, they can hypnotically induce an illness into a person, and it will manifest itself in the tissue systems rather quickly. And then, of course, down here you can actually be sick, and at the same time you feel sick, and at the same time you know you're sick. So it works up and down, see? But there's time lags between these responses of the overshadowing energies in these various layers of the body that we have. So we have, let's review, we have soul, overshadowing mental body, overshadowing astral body, overshadowing etheric body. Now, these I know are very deep concepts. They're easily argued. I'm glad I'm not being asked questions, because I will not argue with you about them. They're simply a foundation work to understand the processes that we observe, being that we're kind of bound to this corporeal form at this time. Okay? According to theosophy, it's more or less recognized that upon death of the entity, of course, the etheric body leaves very quickly, exhausts itself, and in a very short time, the astral body itself will also exhaust itself to a very, very nebulous framework. The mental body, in time, more or less is now perpetuating itself in this time base that we call. And of course, the soul is the thing that has the deepest memory of all. Okay. That's called the soul. Yes, the causal body is the soul. Okay. That's the foundation that we have. It explains many things. It explains, for a fact, the phenomena of ghosts witnessed very shortly after someone's death. Okay. Or where there's a very powerful charge on the astral or sensation body that perpetuates a ghost-like effect. There's very well-known sightings around the world of various haunted castles and haunted houses and haunted burial grounds and so forth. These are the astral remnants. It's not really an entity per se. It's more like an energy charge perpetuating itself in space. Okay. This astral body is the cause of a lot of problems when it comes to bioenergetic medicine. You know, for example, you have all this fancy equipment today. Some say they can find homeopathic remedies by computers and digital things or what have you. The little problem with it is you can take a test right now and you can take a test 5 minutes from now and it doesn't show the same thing. Why? Because the emotions have such a strong effect upon the tissue systems, and that in turn very quickly affects the etheric body, which then in turn affects the galvanic skin response or the electrical flows that we have in the body. Okay? So this is a good example of how the astral body has such a powerful seizure over the tissue systems. So the more emotions and sensations, likes and dislikes, opinions that you have, the factor is the more illness you're going to have. Now, way out here in the aura, there's these little points of light that have memory capacities that actually, I can show you, are quite vivid when they're activated. And when you have a conglomerate of these things sparkling around you all at one time, it gets to the point to where we have very powerful control factors over the body. Very powerful control factors, to the point it starts steering glands to start doing things. You have indigestion, you have upset stomach, you're constipated, you have an eye that twitches, which you can't control, you can't stop it. Muscles are twitching all throughout your body, right? You have faulty steering mechanisms, and all of these things affect your health. So once you discharge these little points of light, then they have no control value over you anymore. See? And all of these things have patterns and reactions that we're going to be talking to you about, and how to discharge these flows so that they no longer have a control value. So in other words, we have the ability to play the cassette tape of your life and wipe out all its volume. It will always have memory, but it's no longer going to have any sound or control over your being. It's there, it happened, and you forgot about it. no longer has a control value. The problem with the emotionally disturbed person is there's so many points of light outside on the aura, they're all sparkling and discharging in randometry at so many different points in time. It's to the point that when lots of these are going off at the same time, you have what you call basically an insane person. So the star chart, the astrological chart, shows certain patterns that you know were behavior patterns that reacted in the past and that are now acting now in the future. They perpetuated themselves in time because basically there was an unresolved conflict. There was a violent death. There was a very powerful emotional experience that happened because the person was too far down in havingness, and the havingness has perpetuated itself. So that's what we look for in the chart, and that's what we're going to be going over. So now that you all have that as a background, I had to do that because otherwise, going into the rest of this material, you would be saying, why is he saying all this? Okay. Let's go to your next page where our axiom number 1 is the tendency of the physical universe is condensation, precipitation by rotary action. I'm going to give you now some of the physics of all of this. The tendency of the physical universe is condensation and precipitation. Remember I told you, you can think about a disease, and it has relatively little effect, but if you think about it more and more over time, it starts then to affect your emotional body, and then in time that emotional body can affect the etheric body. Thus, the group of physicians that have the most back problems are chiropractors. The group of physicians that have the most psychiatric problems are psychiatrists, right? Because they, through the study and through the contact and the impact over time, it has begun to affect their emotional being. Okay? So what once was a fleeting thought in time became a perpetuation of thought in time, which then in turn started to affect the astral corporeal being. Okay? What is the usual statement in psychiatry? And when is it time to discharge a patient? When the insanity of the moment creates a point to where it becomes logical, it's time to discharge your patient, because now you have become emotionally involved with that person. So when their insanity becomes logical and starts to make sense, it's time to refer. Right? And this again is all part of the emotional body, which really is just a total reaction of agreements and disagreements. Agree and disagree. And we'll be getting into that. So it's a matter of precipitation into form. Now, there are some very good arguments for the effect of the planets based upon sequences in time. Because really what we're talking about from a physical standpoint is how these emotions actually precipitate into the flesh and affect the bioenergetic complex of the entity. If you look at just the cycles of nature and take it from a Hertzian concept, you can see that there's a very logical argument for this, which I put in my manual that I sent to you, in the Astrobiotic manual, the relative physics about that based upon nature's method of storing energy by precipitation in a toroidal space, which the Hindus call chakras or wheels, okay, there are certain rhythmic patterns that occur throughout nature. You have down here basically a 0 point, minute rhythms, which in turn you have little higher ones called cardiac rhythms, little higher ones you call millisecond nerve transmission rhythms, and so forth and so on. Okay? These are the rhythmic reactions that are found in nature. And you see we can go all the way down into Plutonian revolution cycles of some 250 years, where there's revolutionary shifts in ethnics and customs. And this, of course, has now become a guide for you to understand how planetary movements show patterns in nature. It's just a matter of interpretation and understanding patterns in nature. Now let's look at it from an electromagnetic standpoint. The basis of my first book was man is a light being. This is a light-bound operated universe, and we are precipitation of light into mass. Therefore, if we start with the highest cycle of energy, we start with color, which then precipitates down into an effect well known in biology called infrared radiation, which is known as metabolic heat, which then in turn becomes millimeter waves, or what's called microwaves, which your body very much responds to, which then in turn becomes radio frequency waves, and at this point you have the basis of neural transmission and the forms of memories by radio frequency. You can actually say that when the astral body impacts the etheric body, you essentially have radio frequency transmission. And that's very well known in physiology. There was some work done back shortly after World War II on this effect, but essentially the operative mechanism of the brain is a radio frequency generator. And those nerve transmissions create very, very minute radio waves in the tissue systems, which acts as we call a reaction of sensation and memory. And we're going to be talking more about that because these radio frequency forms are very, very therapeutic and also very, very, very dangerous at the same time. As it precipitates further down into the flesh, you go from radio waves down to low frequency waves, which then in turn affects your cardiac rhythms and your brain wave rhythms. So in essence, the body is one big demodulating harmonic. It's one big demodulating harmonic. And when it harmonically resonates in tune with itself, it perpetuates itself in time. It will maintain its form. When it is disharmonic, it will become dissonant and will disintegrate itself rapidly in time. AIDS is a very good example of that. Premature death of the organism by disintegration, loss of immune function, actual sloughing off of tissue, emaciation, and death. Dissonant wave patterns resonating himself within the framework of the aura and the tissue systems. Okay. Now, the big standpoint is when you get all the way down to delta waves, which your body does every night when you sleep. You actually go down so low and so far into a delta wave pattern, your body every night simulates coma. Yet if you have access to your astral body, you will have a phenomena to realize that you're also very alive. It's called dreams. Right? Now the problem with humanity today, one of the problems, I believe, is that they become so dissonant and so hypnotically induced that they can't remember their dreams. In other words, they don't remember who they are. And that's when you hit one big flash point called the 0 point. Now the 0 point's a very interesting concept because that was a big topic of Nikola Tesla. Okay. It's also a big topic of Hindu astrology because if you can calculate the 0 point, you can also calculate the time of birth and the time of death through the astrological chart. Very interesting study. Supposedly a very secretive study, and not too many people release the data that allows you to do that in terms of studying the star chart to the effect that you can determine the point of death, which is the 0 point, based on your 0 point. Okay? And basically the 0 point is where astral body meets etheric body. It's where astral body meets etheric body. And it's at that point we have some very elaborate scalar physics, which I outlined for you in the photobiotic manual, which I don't need to repeat to you because it's there in print. But there seems to be a shift from electronic valence factors within the electrical framework to the point of the nucleus of the atom. In other words, you're dealing with one big, huge astral grid work, so to speak. An astral grid work, where you're actually controlling the nucleus of the atom. Let me see how I can do this simpler for you. you have an electron, correct? That spins around a nucleus, according to the Niels Bohr's concept, which is actually a very good concept. I would like to know if perhaps maybe he was a Hermeticist, because the Hermetic axiom is as above, so below, and that these patterns repeat themselves in nature. So you have a sun, and within the sun you have a solar system of revolving planets. Well, likewise, within the atom, which is a miniature, micro-miniature scale of that, you have a central nucleus with rotating planets around it. It is the sharing of these planets, or what's called electrons, that actually determines the bonding together of things we call mass, correct? Mass is basically reactionary sharing of electrons. That has quite a bit of mathematical predictability, known to us as a science called chemistry, and also physics. But there are bigger cyclical patterns that, because we're just a small entity in a speck of time, we seem to get precipitated to the point where mass becomes reality to us. We seem to lose sight of the fact that within the nucleus there are certain gridwork patterns that are determining rhythmic patterns throughout the universe. That being our star-based reference called the zodiac. In other words, there's a deeper energy network, which has been called scalar waves, which precipitate or react within a substance called ether that determines even longer range effects as to the fact that there is a certain form of destiny of things to happen. And that's what the astrological chart really reveals, is a lot of destiny. So that there's a deeper grid work within the nucleus, which is a reactionary zero point between electronic bonding, nucleus, and gridwork patterns that operate simultaneously in space and time. That's the simplest way I can tell you from fathoming that. That also means that we're dealing in an optical universe, because we're dealing with electron effects, which are precipitations of photons. So you might say that the next layer up on this etheric band would be photons, and the next layer within the photon would be the astral atom, which has many names in Hindu and Theosophy and various systems. So this astral atom would in fact means that emotions are contagious. Sure, they're contagious. If you're affected by me, what I'm saying, I'm feeling things. I'm affecting everybody in the room with my astral atoms, aren't I? So, you're dealing with resonant patterns within ether that affect tissue systems. They precipitate down into the flesh. Now let's go to the next page, and let's get our overall scheme of what we're talking about here. You have a band of reference around a periphery of fixed stars we call the zodiac, which represents patterns of consciousness, evolutionary points of the entity, which then in turn affects their chakras. It's an overall scheme that we have in astrology. Each sign is a whole story. Each sign is an evolutionary period in history based upon the movements of the sun and the earth. We are now entering the Aquarian age. And by understanding that how the sun and the earth is entering the Aquarian age tells us a story about what's to come, because that's ruled by the planet Uranus, which is very electric and very dynamic. So big things are going to change. We see that today with our computer revolution. If there's anything that's a hallmark of the Aquarian age, we would have to say it's the electronic transmission of data. Okay? If there's anything that would be a hallmark of the Piscean age, it would be the astral contagion of emotions affecting humanity in very powerful ways. And so on through the stars. And we'll be talking about these stories Dr. Mara will be talking about these stories and these pictures these things present, so that you have focal points of reference from understanding. So my job for you is to teach you how to look at a star map and just quickly start to know things, because you understand the focal points of reference of how each of these make a story. Okay? Within that frame of reference, as we take the concept as above, so below, there's precipitation of energy. So the next layer that the fixed stars would precipitate energy patterns would be in planetary movements around the sun. Okay? The planetary movements around the sun sort of color or intone the effect of the fixed stars. Okay? And that, in turn, our next base of reference, we're talking very geocentrically here, would be the sun. The sun is our source of vitality. Therefore, in a star chart, we have an immediate guide as to a person's health. The very first thing we look at in a medical chart is where is the person's sun and what is it reacting with different planets. That tells us immediately the vitality of the organism, because that is the very basis of all of your metabolic fires. And we discuss this very, very much in the photobiotics book, about on a biochemical level how this reacts. Now we're taking it to the next step from a very cosmic standpoint of reaction patterns that we understand from where the sun is. So the sun sign tells us a lot, but that in turn is affected or intoned by planetary positions. Next we look at the moon, okay? Because the moon is the next closest orbiting body next to the Earth. If it can control the tides, it certainly can control other things. If it can move huge masses of water the way it does cyclically, it certainly can move your astral body cyclically. And remember, I mentioned the study of astrology is not to learn how to be guided by the stars, it's learn how to get away from it. And the one you want to get away from is the moon. In fact, when you study esoteric astrology, the first study that you do is start to clock the patterns of the moon and start watching your own reactions in your own mind, because you want to shift out of that moon-based cycle. And there's lots of esoteric interpretations of that. You know, you can say the moon's a dead planet. It represents a dead portion of humanity that will not survive into the next age, that being the Aquarian age. We're now seeing a time where people are becoming more in control of their emotions, okay? Women are becoming more autonomous in their beings, because in a star chart, the moon is more important in the health aspect in a woman's chart, whereas in a man's chart, we look at the sun because it has more control over the male entity. Okay? But we're seeing a time here where everyone's starting to get in control of their moon cycles. Then next, we have something we call houses when we study the star chart, okay? Houses. We'll be showing you some of these kinds of slides. The houses of foods, okay? Because as the Earth turns, certain reactionary patterns are precipitated at your time of birth. And the houses represent environmental factors that are around you and what they were like when you were born. In fact, in psychological astrology, the first instruction is, if you study anything in the beginning, study your houses, and you'll learn to know more about a person than you can through the planets and the zodiac. You study the houses, and I'm going to give you the astronomical basis of houses and what they are in just a few minutes. The next thing that affects the entity is the geography, the actual regional location. I can see you're all a little bit confused about houses. Let me just tell you very quickly what a house is. Okay? Let's take this to be planet Earth. And the Earth turns approximately 1 degree every 4 minutes as it turns about its axis, okay? And we basically divide the Earth. This would be North Pole, this would be South Pole. As we have 12 signs of the zodiac, we divide the Earth into 12 longitudinal pieces of pie. Okay? So every couple of hours, the Earth is changing a whole sector, going from one house to the next. And based upon the time you were born, whether you're born in the daytime or the nighttime, determines what house you were in at that time, based upon some rotary concepts of rhythmic movements we call the horoscope or the star chart. Okay? So it's just, again, it's another pattern, okay? And it's all based upon sunrise and sunset. So you're born within a house or a sector of the Earth. This is why we need your location of birth, okay? That determines your house location. And then you are then born in a geography or a regional location, which then further intones your childhood. And those are very powerful houses as well, okay? I mean, if you're world traveled, it's very easy to start recognizing differences in people's emotional complexes just by where they were born. Those, in turn, are affected by electromagnetic activities, solar photon activity, and so forth, which very much affects the nervous system. And taking it down further, affecting human behavior and ultimately human health. So really, what are we? We are one big oscillating, vacillating, harmonic, dissonant waveform of energies, all impinging themselves down into a speck of time here on the planet Earth, sitting in this building in Newcastle, Nevis, West Indies. And there's so many precipitating energy patterns happening so quickly and so fast that the mind can scarcely recognize them. So what astrology does for you is help take you into the big picture of the whole dynamic affecting a person's long-term health and longevity. The really big picture. And the funny thing about it is it is the most powerful thing to see what discharging these emotional reactions that people have impinging on their aura due to the physiology and the behavior of a person. We're talking about instant healing. Instant healing. I have done past life regressions, and I have seen cancers disappear in 3 months. That's how powerful these things are. Pain can be obliterated within microseconds. Okay? Because the emotional mechanism of the person, the astral body, right now has such a powerful seizure upon a person at this time in humanity. And they're to the point they are hypnotically induced. They have very powerful energies, and the person is scarcely able to recognize them. They become hypnotically induced to the point that they feel, in fact, that they are part of themselves. And when you discharge those emotions, you have, within minutes, a different person. So what we're trying to do is intone the person back to their soul, because at the soul point, what was mentioned as the causal body, that's the entity that knows all. It sees past and it sees future. And when you can invoke that in a split second of time within a person's consciousness, they suddenly will realize there's no fear of death because there is none. And that's when you have a healing take place, a true healing. That's when your other remedial efforts, as in homeopathy, acupuncture, all the forms of bioenergetic medicine, will start to work and work very easily and very readily. So now, I want you to go to page 6 so we can understand the star chart. The Earth basically has 3 mechanisms or movements, and that's what we're really looking at the star chart. we're wanting to see where the stars were at the time of birth, and from that depict a pattern. And as I said, my job for you, after 3 days, you should feel very comfortable in just picking up a chart and going, huh, oh yeah, it's obvious. Hey, you got, I want you to just feel really handed, just looking at a chart and going, oh yeah, oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
The Earth has 3 particular movements, okay? And we deal with what we call geocentric astrology, Earth-based astrology. Yes, there's a heliocentric or a sun-based astrology. That's one of the new schools popping up now. But really, the important one for us is geocentric. Why? Because of its rich history. Okay? Now, don't be dissuaded. Don't be dissuaded when you pick up a book of astronomy and they start laughing at people like Kepler and Copernicus and these other people that thought that the sun rotated around the Earth. Right? You saw what it cost Galileo, recognizing otherwise. Don't be too dissuaded, because when you study astrology, you'll realize there's such a rich history here that there must have been some purposeful mistranslations descended down into the history books, because it has an extremely deep history, particularly in Hindustan, which is from the Vedas, is where it all comes from. So yes, there were certain cultures that made some mistakes and had some kind of weird ideas, but they were just getting what they could from the Indian culture, because that's really where it started. Hindu astrology has an extremely accurate record, to the amazement of any astronomer who would go into the Vedas and read how these people some 20, 30,000 years ago knew so much about planetary movements. But we deal with geocentric astrology, as does Hindu, because there's a history of patterns here that is important. And I'll be getting more into that in a little while. Okay? It's its rich history that we borrow from, because realistically speaking, there is no zodiac of animals out there. I think you all know that. There is no ram up in the sky that has a neon sign glowing Aries, right? It's just patterns of energy, and that for the convenience of the population and for the time and culture at that time, animals were depicted because people were in contact with nature. So a zodiac sign says a lot, A zodiac sign says a lot. So Pisces has 2 fish going in different directions, which was the time Christ came and started a lot of problems with history, because everybody went in 2 directions. Okay? So each thing says a story simply because we can reach contact points of concepts. Okay? First of all, the Earth revolves around a top on its own axis, moving 1 degree every 4 minutes, that we've commonly known as day and night cycles. Okay? Second of all, we also know that the Earth rotates around the sun, and it does it in sort of a warble on a plane of ecliptic, or a flat plane. And because it's tilted, the North Pole is tilted towards the star Polaris, we have a change in seasons. And those seasons mark the demarcation times of a cyclical band of energy. Okay? Which is just seen here as the simple zodiac. It moves around that zodiac once a year. Every 365 point some odd days, it moves around. And as it moves through the seasons, it denotes certain patterns of nature, which then denotes the certain patterns in humanity. And then lastly, the third movement it makes is that it rotates on its own top, as you can see down there in number 3. And at this time, it's pointing to Polaris, and in 25,000 years from now, it'll be pointing towards the Vega star. But as it does that, each time the Earth moves over to the sun moving into Aries, it appears to move back just a few seconds. In fact, it appears to move back about 50 seconds. So that apparently it's moving through these cycles or these bands, and each time it comes back around, this goes backwards and backwards and backwards and backwards to the point now we're reaching Aquarius. So at the time of the vernal equinox, there's a shift. Because each time you look at the star tonight and you look at that same star a year from now, it actually moved backwards some 50 seconds. Okay? And that's known as a precession of equinoxes. So as a result of that movement, we now come to the fundamental difference between what we call tropical astrology, based upon the tropical signs of the seasonal rhythms, and Hindu astrology, which uses fixed stars as its points of reference. Are you confused? You will be. You have to study a little bit more astronomy to get to that stage, but I'll try to explain to you the fundamental difference. The fundamental difference is this, is that when Greek astrology was laid to the books, at the time of Ptolemy, Aristotle, Hippocrates, and so forth, where the Earth rose at the vernal equinox, or what sunrise pointed to, was the number 1 degree of Aries, more or less. Okay? But since we're now almost 2,000 years from that time, the point of Aries, from an astronomical point of view, has moved backwards well into Pisces and now is very close to the edge of Aquarius. Okay? The Hindus use the fixed star of the first 0 degrees of Aries, I think it's called Ashwini, okay? And they have a little different zodiac system with a different interpretation, obviously because they're looking at a different pattern. Obviously also because they're a different culture. They think differently than we do. They're Buddhic. They're not Judeo-Christian, okay? The Greeks, however, have used and still used the vernal equinox, or the first day of Aries, okay, which you can see here occurs on generally March 21st, and uses that as a fixed plane of reference. There's nothing wrong with that. There is no doubt that the Earth returns at that point each time of March 21st. It's very easily mathematically calculated, and from there we divide the sky and the pie into 12 planes. That's all. And we divide, as do the Hindus. We don't argue too much about houses either. We divide the Earth into 12 sectors. So you have 12 pie in the skies outside, and then you take Earth and you divide that into 12 sectors as well. So you have 12 pies in the skies and you have 12 sectors on Earth. That's all. And these are just points of reference. Both are mathematically predictable to the point that, as I will show you very readily, are computed on a computer so that you don't have to use these complicated star charts like we did back in the 60s and 70s. You can now pull up a tropical or a Hindu chart in about 6 to 8 seconds. Anybody you want, because the movement of stars are mathematically predictable. We're going to show you by computer how to construct a horoscope. The best program available is this one put out by Time Cycles Research, who I am working with. And it comes in a booklet like this, and the diskettes for you to load into your computer so they can all be calculated instantaneously with a nice laser print quality, which you all have received from your chart that was generated by this program. Okay, now I want to show you how easy it is to get a program popped up on screen, which is just light years ahead of what we used to have to do when we studied this. You basically open up your hard disk, you go over to I/O programs, you double-click it and bring it up. Now, the I/O programs has quite a few functions with this particular computer. One is you can open up just a basic horoscope, a natal horoscope, and this is called the I/O Horoscope Edition. You also have another one called I/O Edition, which allows you to do bi-wheels, or compare 2 charts all at once. A comparative chart on the inside and a larger chart on the outside, so you can look at 2 people. Or you can progress your own chart, for example. You can look at where the stars were when you were born, and you can look at where the stars are today. Okay? You can also do transit searches with that particular edition. There is also a forecast program, which will give you a printout of where all the planets are going to be for the next year, okay, for your chart or anybody else's. And these are good for determining what we call tendencies to disease or tendencies to accidents. For example, if you want to know when your reactionary times are, you want to pull up a progress chart for the next year to show where your Mars is going to be. And how it's going to affect your Mars now. So that's an inflammatory time of your life. That's when you're liable to fevers. It's also when you're liable to accidents. Okay? Then they have another program they call the relationship program, which is a synastry chart to compare, for example, husband and wife, or yourself and a business partner. You want to see where the compatibilities and incompatibilities are. So you've got 4 basic programs, and I'm going to show you at this juncture how to open up a horoscope. You double-click the IO horoscope program, and we're going to open up a new file. So I just click New, and there's New. Now we're looking at a natal chart. If you pull down screen, you can also do a sunrise chart if you do not know the person's time of birth. So it automatically will just calculate the birth time at sunrise. I open to the next file. You can either choose tropical or sidereal, which is Hindu. Okay? In other words, you're using a moving star chart, which is tropical, or you're using a sidereal chart, which is Hindu. And then under the third file is you have all the various house systems to work with. I prefer Placidus, but there's also Koch, Equal, Campanus, Meridian, Regiomontanus, Topocentric, Porphyry, Natural, or the Vedic, which is Hindu. Okay? So you have all of those various multiple interpretations. We'll be talking about those to you, but with medical astrology, based on its history, based upon all the physicians in days past that have studied medical astrology and have put down the various concepts that we work with, we use tropical Placidus as our base of reference. Okay. So let's now see how quickly you can pop up a chart. Anybody want to give me a name? Penny? Penny. Last name, please? Skinny. So Penny Skinny was born, give me a star date.
February 11th.
February 11th. So we type in FEB 11 1968 in the box where it says date. Okay? And Penny Skinny was born at what time?
2:28 p.m.
Okay, 2:48 p.m. was the time. We're all clicked in. And where was Penny Skinny born?
Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Oh, Philadelphia. Okay. Okay. Now we got the data in. We don't know the latitude and longitude because that determines the house system, you see. So in the old days, we'd have to go to a table of houses, and we'd have to muck through these charts, and, you know. Then we'd have to deal with time changes in the USA, which is another calculation we have to make. And we don't have to do all that now. We just come over to Atlas. We click in the Atlas. You see the little world turn. It means it's bringing up the program. There's the Atlas. We got Philadelphia and the county of Philadelphia at latitude 39 degrees, longitude 75 degrees west at 10 seconds. I click insert, and there it is automatically calculated. Now I go to the calculation position for tropical Placidus. Calculated. It's done. It's all done. Okay. Now I go into the design portion, and I can pull down any set of charts that I would like to see. I can pull down a blank wheel, chart notes, data page, European, horoscope, hub chart, legend, planet table, or with small glyphs. Okay? So in other words, you can have it with ketchup, pickles, heavy mayonnaise, or easy with rye. Okay? So we'll pull up data page, and 1, 2, 3, bingo, Penny Skinny's chart is now done. Isn't that impressive? That's done. All the angles are calculated of the planets. You also get with this the declinations of all the planets. We also see the house cusp. We got the degrees there according to tropical Placidus, and personal points. For example, the midhaven, the ascension, and also planets by sign. We got 1 fire and earth, 1 planet in fire, 4 in earth, 2 in air, 3 in water, we now know that this person is a melancholic temperament, according to the Hippocratic concepts, which I'll be getting you into. In other words, you look at where the planets are, and the predominant element is shown or appeared by where most of the planets are located. So we now have a melancholic earth-based type, which is also called the fall type. And the new thing I'm working on, we're calling astroaesthetics. Astroaesthetics. So we can determine with the fall type, we've got the skin type, we've got the colors they should wear, the makeup they should use, and so forth. Or from a homeopathic concept, we know that this person should more or less be fitted in the domain of melancholic remedies, according to the work of many of the homeopaths, and as well as Dr. Fleury, which is another program we're working on which will interface with this.